occasional series of morning speaker meetings with Yvette Cooper. We've done, I think, 3 in this series. This one was fixed up on Friday afternoon, so thank you for all coming at short notice. This is, of course, an interesting week in British politics. We don't quite know what's to happen. Indeed, I would say myself that given that we leave the EU in a few days, it's astonishing that we don't actually know the outcome of the Brexit process at all. It seems to me that at least 4 options are roughly equally likely, and one is much less. The equally likely options are Mrs May's deal passing eventually in some form at the last minute, a version of that but for a much softer Brexit, customs union and/or Norway passing at the last minute. Hi, Dennis. Or thirdly, a general election, fourthly, a referendum. I think those are all quite possible. None of them is perhaps very likely, but one of them may happen. But the 5th option, which is I think less likely, is Britain leaving without a deal. And one of the reasons it's less likely is because Yvette Cooper's worked very hard with people on both sides of the House to try and prevent that, and has extracted a promise of Mrs May to have a vote on whether or not Article 50 should be extended, which is due to be held next Thursday if Mrs May doesn't break her promises. We're not quite sure what's going to happen with the vote on the meaningful vote on Tuesday, the vote on no deal on Wednesday, the extension of Article 50 on Thursday. But to tell us how she sees the next steps, delighted to have Yvette Cooper. Everything's on the record and it's being live streamed. Yvette, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you to the CER for hosting today. This is obviously a very turbulent week in politics, and tomorrow we're supposed to vote on the Prime Minister's deal. It is the same deal that we voted on in January, and it was defeated then by 230 votes. It's the same deal that the Prime Minister herself voted against in February, when she supported Graham Brady's amendment calling for alternative arrangements instead. And tomorrow, we're supposed to vote on it again. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. And what has the Prime Minister been doing for 8 weeks? Even if by magic the Attorney General comes up with something to add at the last minute, we will have barely hours to consider it before we are supposed to vote. And this is the worst kind of chaos and brinkmanship. So there's been no plan B, no flexibility, no reaching out, no change to the red lines. The clock is truly run down, the can kicked and squashed, and the vote has run out. We have no idea what kind of Brexit we are going to get in just 2 weeks' time, and I can't quite believe I'm saying that. Businesses don't know if they're going to face tariffs, public services don't know if they're going to face shortages, families don't know if food prices are about to go up. How can anyone plan? And our allies across the world are flabbergasted at the mess we seem to be in. We're drifting with no grip. The country also feels more divided than ever. The only people is the belief that government and politicians are screwing things up, and everyone is shouting at each other. So half the country, particularly the younger half, will feel betrayed if we leave like this. But the other half, including many of those whose voices too often don't get heard, will feel betrayed if we just stop and give up. And betrayal is a very dangerous emotion in politics. It can poison democracies. So carry on like this, and we won't hold our country together. Carry on like this, and whatever the Brexit outcome, nothing will endure. The Prime Minister had a responsibility to steer us through this and to find a course for the country that is sustainable, has legitimacy in the national interest. Now maybe she still has a cunning plan, but the stakes are now far high to assume that she has this under control. Time is running out, and we cannot afford to stand back and wait. So I want to propose some next steps this morning. Some next steps in terms of what happens this week, but also what happens in the next few weeks after. In the midst of the chaos this week, to talk about what should happen in future weeks may seem to be missing the point. But it's going to be Thursday before we know it, and then we'll be asking what on earth happens next. And so that's why I wanted to set out some next steps today that draws on some of the cross-party work that we have been doing. Theresa May needs to accept that her approach is not working. As Prime Minister, she needs to show leadership and reset the debate. This is the point to pivot, not to dig in. There are practical steps the Prime Minister can take now, not easy ones, but sensible ones, step by step to build more consensus around a way through this. And if she won't find forward, then then Parliament has a responsibility to do so instead. And once again, we will be ready to work cross-party on amendments to do that. 2 weeks ago, we made a start. Fearful that the Prime Minister was drifting towards the cliff edge of leaving the EU with no deal in place, we put forward a cross-party plan to create a parliamentary safeguard. In the end, the Prime Minister adopted it. 500 MPs voted for it, only 20 voted against. And as a result of that work, if the Prime Minister does not have a deal going through this week, Parliament should be able to vote on whether to leave with no deal or to extend Article 50. The head of the CBI, Carolyn Fairburn, described it as a brief moment of sanity. But if we're not careful, it will prove only brief indeed. There are rumours that the Prime Minister will pull the vote tomorrow and then pull the votes on Wednesday and Thursday too. Whatever she does tomorrow, I don't believe she will pull the votes on no deal and extending Article 50. She gave me her word, she gave Parliament her word, and I don't believe that the Prime Minister would straight up lie on something so important as this. There is another rumour that she might abstain on the vote, simply leaving the country for talks in Brussels to avoid the vote. I find it hard to believe that that can be true either. She's the Prime Minister, she cannot be tricked. This vote will be about whether to knowingly jeopardise medicine supplies, knowingly stop our police getting information on wanted criminals, knowingly smash a hammer into the heart of our manufacturing industry by leaving with no deal. For a Prime Minister to vote to put all of those things at risk would be unthinkable. To run away from that vote would be worse. It would be a complete derogation of duty. So yes, the Prime Minister needs to show some leadership, insisting that her government vote against no deal and for some extra time. But then she needs to answer the question, time for what? Because the risk is that the Prime Minister will just do more of the same, more running around the same circles on the backstop and running down the new clock. And then we will just be back in the same place in a few months' time. So I think the Prime Minister needs to understand why her approach isn't working in order to understand what would be helpful to do next. And I think there are two underlying problems, and neither of them are called the backstop. The first is that she has done nothing to build consensus, and the second is that she has done everything to avoid clarity on the future. Or put a different way, we are more divided than ever, and the deal isn't a proper deal. None of the big decisions have been taken, only ducked and deferred. I want to take those points in turn. So Parliament is fragmented because the country is fragmented. 3 years on from the referendum, nothing's been done to heal the divides. That's bad for cohesion and democracy, but it's also very unstable. Brexit involves major constitutional change. Constitutional frameworks need to be underpinned by a broad consensus, either a clear majority of support, or at least for enough of the opponents to be reconciled. And they need to emerge from a legitimate process that commands respect. Otherwise, they simply won't last. So Welsh devolution, despite being only passed by 50.3% to 49.7%, has been sustained because its original opponents have been involved and reconciled. The Scottish referendum is settled for now, not just because of the result, but because of the Smith Commission that followed it and brought people together. Since the 2016 Brexit referendum, far from trying to bring the country together, the Prime Minister has done the opposite. But it didn't have to be like this. Almost 500 MPs voted to trigger Article 50, and more than half of them, like me, had voted and campaigned for Remain, but felt we should support the Prime Minister in that vote in order to respect the referendum result. So people were ready to make this process work. I argued at the time for a cross-party commission to oversee the negotiations and to bring different views together. So did William Hague. And I even proposed it to the Cabinet Minister, who was initially in charge of Brexit preparations, one Oliver Letwin. I said at that time, if the deal is going to be sustainable, it needs cross-party support and a broad consensus behind it. But the Prime Minister refused. She refused proper consultation with business, unions, the public on what kind of Brexit we should have, and she did everything possible to avoid or frustrate parliamentary votes. The truth is, we have more consultation on inland waterways regulations or door closures warnings on the DLR than on the big Brexit options for this country. Instead of reaching out, the Prime Minister's just bunkered in. instead of talking with people across the country, the Prime Minister has only been talking to her party, and only to one section of her party too. She has allowed hardliners in the ERG group to hijack the government and hijack the country. And I feel personally very angry at the Prime Minister for doing this to the country. Whilst I've often strongly disagreed with her on all kinds of issues, I have always respected her. And I always thought that she would be a grown-up who would be sensible and responsible when so much was at stake. Instead, her handling of the Brexit process has proved reckless and irresponsible, and she cannot be allowed to carry on like this. Part of the reason there is no consensus is also because no one knows what Brexit will really look like. So the Prime Minister's deal isn't really a deal at all. It's a stopgap with a backstop, a holding position with an insurance policy attached. The deal she put forward is a blind Brexit. It doesn't tell us anything about the future relationship. Will it be close to Canada? Will it be nearly Norway or a resuscitated Chequers? None of us have a clue. The political declaration is a fudge. Paragraph 23 talks about building on the single customs territory. Well, that is a customs union. Paragraph 17 talks about an independent trade policy. Well, that is the opposite. So it's like we're leaving and slamming the door behind us without any idea where we will rest our heads tonight, following the Conservative Party on a journey into the unknown while they all fight with each other over the map. And it matters. It matters because even if her deal goes through, it means leaving on a false prospectus, which could lead to an even bigger political mess when it unravels later on and we face the challenges around the Northern Ireland border, customs and frictionless trade. It also matters because that lack of clarity is partly why we are so paralysed now. So the reason the Prime Minister lost by a phenomenal 230 votes in January wasn't just about the backstop, it was about the fact that the future wasn't pinned down, that people on all sides fear that that weakens us in the negotiations to come. So those who hate the backstop fear it's going to last forever. Those who like the backstop fear it will be ripped up. Those who want a close relationship fear they will get a distant one. Those who want distance fear ending up too close. I'm worried we won't get a customs union for Yorkshire manufacturing. Hard Brexiteers worry we won't be able to do a new deregulatory trade deal with the US. And none of us, from either side, want to write a blank cheque now and trust the Prime Minister and Michel Barnier to sort it out later on. So the Prime Minister hoped that that fudge would help everyone sign up to it. Instead, it's done the opposite. The initial insistence by the EU on finalising the withdrawal agreement and the transition before discussing the principles of the future relationship has been illogical and counterproductive and has helped to create these problems now. So they also need to realise that more flexibility and more clarity is required. And the recent stated willingness to make the political declaration more binding or more precise suggests they may be interested in a better way forward now. So what are the next steps? Well, we have to use an extension to make decisions about what kind of Brexit we should have and work out how we build consensus on the way forward. And the government should start with some practical steps that most people should be able to sign up to, whether they will remain, whether they want a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit, or not to leave at all. The process itself isn't the answer, but without a process that has some kind of legitimacy, purpose and organisation, we will never get to an answer. So instead of always banging on about the backstop, the Prime Minister should focus on the future relationship. Instead of getting stuck in the insurance policy, she should focus on getting agreement on what kind of Brexit people want to see. A proper plan, not a fudged political declaration. She should put the withdrawal agreements to one side until we've agreed the principles of where we want to end up, then come back to the agreement with its transitional period and its backstop insurance policy and reassess it in that light. This isn't about which side of the referendum you were on, it's about knowing what we're getting and making decisions. The Vote Leave campaign during the referendum said, taking back control is a careful change, not a sudden stop. We will negotiate the terms of a new deal before we start any legal process to leave. So look, we were going to have to start facing these choices this summer anyway under the Prime Minister's deal. We were going to have to make these decisions during the 2-year transition period while nothing actually changed in practice. So instead, let's take the first few months of the transition period to make those decisions as part of the Article 50 process. Instead, let's decide before we finish Article 50 rather than after. In her letter to Jeremy Corbyn, the Prime Minister promised to give Parliament a bigger say in the mandate for the next phase of the negotiations to address concerns that MPs cannot precisely what the future relationship it would lead to. So why not do that now and get on with it? The Prime Minister should use an Article 50 extension to be bold and offer a series of indicative votes to test Parliament's view, as both Hilary Benn and Frank Field have suggested from different sides of the original referendum debate. Then she should publish the government's draft mandate for the negotiations on the future relationship and let Parliament put amendments to it. There are other alternatives if she can't cope with that, for example, setting up a lighter, quicker version of the Smith Commission to bring people together and put forward proposals. Either way, once Parliament has agreed to negotiating mandate, then the government should seek agreement on the key principles with the EU. That doesn't mean getting the full free trade agreement. Everyone accepts that will take years. But if Parliament votes for a customs union or the EEA or a Chequers-style customs partnership, the government needs to get proper agreement with the EU that it can be done. If Parliament chooses a straightforward option, the process could be relatively swift. But we will be stronger if we take these decisions and negotiate them with the EU before rather than after we finish the Article 50 process. The Prime Minister could put forward any of these things, could draw up any of this process. But if she won't, and if we just end up in stalemate, we just end up with more of this kind of crisis, then Parliament will need to insist on a process like this instead, through amendments, through motions, through legislation if necessary. In addition, the government should use an extension to consult, involve and compromise, at least sow the seeds that can help us reach consensus later on. Businesses, public services, local government should be all involved, and the debate can't just be in Westminster. The Prime Minister should be bold and find new ways to involve the public in a thoughtful and purposeful way, following the experience of Ireland on abortion, or suggestions from Gordon Brown and John Major to hold citizens' assemblies, not as an alternative to parliamentary democracy, but as a way to broaden the debate and feed in views to the government and parliamentary process. And given how controversial this process has been, given the constitutional implications of the final deal, in the end, unless a clear consensus behind it has emerged, I suspect there may need to be some kind of public consent for it to endure, be that through a general election or a referendum, otherwise it just won't last. But the challenge is to find a way to build consent and legitimacy, not just create more anger and division, so that confirmation process is best resolved once we have a clearer view what Brexit looks like. So I believe most people in Britain want the chance to come together again. I don't think most people want us to always be shouting, no matter what you might think from social media. On Saturday in Yorkshire, I talked to a voter who now wants to stop Brexit because he fears it is making the country too divided. And then straight after that, a Remain voter who doesn't want a referendum because he fears it will make the division worse. Both of them told me they wanted the country to come together from different points of view. So wherever we are, and however long this process is, we have to stop the language of betrayal and treachery and establish some respect for each other's views, no matter how much we disagree. All sides of this debate have a sense of patriotism and purpose. And that matters more than ever this week. I've deliberately not argued for a particular end point today because I'm deliberately trying to find a process that has some legitimacy that people can sign up to, whatever their view on Brexit and whatever the final outcome they want to see. And I've done so because I see no other way through, and because I think we'll only solve this step by step. I realise there are plenty of reasons why this might not work, but I can also see far more reasons why every other option won't work, and something still has to happen. And given the mess that we're in, I don't think we can all stand back and hope someone else tries to sort it out or to stay on the sidelines shouting. So I and others will work tirelessly cross-party to try and find a way forward. Politics feels harder than ever right now, but there is so much at stake. And the times when politics isn't easy are also the times when politics matters most. Politics is often described as the art of the possible. But when it feels like it is the art of the impossible, that is when it really counts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yvette. That was very, very provocative and interesting. Great to see so many people have got up to listen to you this morning. You decided not to give us your own preferences for the final outcome, which is fair enough. I won't probe you on that. But I'll ask the first question, which is, everything you're saying implies that Parliament itself starts to become a player in this through the sorts of cross-party channels that you have helped to develop. How far can this go without traditional party structures fragmenting and being thrown into turmoil? Now, to what extent do you think Parliament can really become a player in its own right?
Constitutionally, this is much easier if the Prime Minister takes leadership and if the government takes leadership, and that's that's why most of my speech was about calling on the Prime Minister to do and to take a lead on this, because I still think that she should, and I think it is much harder to do things in a way. I think what we showed when we in the end got the Prime Minister to agree to a proposal that we'd put forward through amendments and through potential legislation was that actually sometimes this is about Parliament putting pressure on to get the government to then change its view, but also that we were able to work effectively cross-party, those of us who are staying very much rooted in our own parties, so for me and to Oliver Letwin and others, to be able to work across party and to get people working together is possible. It is a different way of working to the way that we've done before, but I don't see it as being an alternative to existing party structures. I think it's about pulling parties together as well.
Fine. Who else would like to ask? Yes, I'm from the BBC.
Thanks, Ben Wright from the BBC.
Okay.
Yvette, if the government does change the nature of tomorrow's vote, which seems possible, and make it conditional on further talks, perhaps even scrap the votes on Wednesday or Thursday altogether, what can you do? Will you bring back your own amendment tomorrow? How can you change the process?
So the undertakings that the Prime Minister has given us is that whatever happens in terms of her deal, and even if she doesn't get, if there is no deal in place, then she would be obliged to hold a vote on Wednesday on whether to leave with no deal, and a vote on Thursday on whether to extend Article 50. As far as I'm concerned, those pledges and those promises still stand. Whatever she decides to do tomorrow in terms of her meaningful vote, the pledges that she has made, the word that she has given to us in Parliament about holding the vote on the Wednesday and Thursday still stand. Because the whole point about our process wasn't to make it conditional on any further meaningful vote taking place. It was simply to say, if we get to this point, there are only 2.5 weeks to go. Nobody has a clue what kind of Brexit we're going to get, what on earth the circumstances are going to be, and we've got the car industry spending tens of millions of pounds in preparation for no deal and hoping that that money is going to be wasted. So you can't leave everybody in this final situation with the final brinkmanship. So it was for that reason we said the votes needed to happen this week, regardless of whether or not there's been another meaningful vote. So my view is those commitments still stand. Those are the commitments that she made to us. And I believe she will stand by them, because as I said earlier, I just don't believe a Prime Minister of this country, and I don't believe Theresa May would straight up lie to us about something like that. It's too important.
Okay, Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government.
Thank you. If there's one thing that there seems to be cross-party consensus on, it's that nobody wants to fight the European elections in May, June. But the sort of process you're setting out doesn't sound like one that can be completed, guaranteed, and negotiated by May 23rd or even June 30th. So what sort of length of extension do you think the UK will therefore have to hold those European elections?
So my assumption is that if we get through this sort of stage process this week, that the Prime Minister would come forward with an extension of around 3 months. That's been my assumption. I think it clearly makes no sense for a departing EU member state to hold the European Parliament, a member state that's in the Article 50 process, just as there are special arrangements for accession countries not to have to hold European elections in the same process. So I think in terms of how long do you need for this process? Look, the truth is, if Parliament decided, for example, on a customs union, actually that might be something you could resolve very quickly with the EU, with the process, and so on. So I think this partly depends on how willing Parliament is to do things, but you could imagine a process that actually was quite a rapid one. And then I think, I know there's been willingness and some discussions to talk about protocols and so on and other measures to make sure that there's no legal uncertainty about it and that the UK doesn't have to have European parliamentary elections.
Okay, now a lot of people want to ask questions. We've got time to squeeze this one over. But firstly, Gary Gibbon from Channel 4 News.
Thank you very much. I was pressing on Charles's initial point, really. And you just said if Parliament decided to pursue a customs union, can you really imagine a minority Conservative government propped up by the DUP implementing that kind of parliamentary will? Aren't we going to end up going for the public consent option that you talk about much more quickly than your sequence suggests?
I think that's the big unknown, is how much the Prime Minister in the end is prepared to reach out. I think if she had done things differently from the start, even with a hung Parliament, it would have been possible to find a course through this, even though there would be some things that different bits of her coalition would not support. You're right, this is difficult, and that's why I think this would be better if this was a process sort of set out really by the government in order to do this. But I end up coming to these conclusions about this as a step-by-step way forward because everything else feels more chaotic. So you're right that we could end up with a general election at any point in this process. You're right that there's all the sort of rumours about the Prime Minister in this process as well. But it just feels like everything is extremely chaotic. There's no attempt at the moment to even find a way through. It may be that I said is not the ideal.
Unless it's for general election or referendum. Secondly, you went through all the processes and you negotiating mandate, consulting the regions, public services, business, and completely doing cross-party stuff, all of which should have happened in the last 33 months. But the idea this could all happen by the end of May isn't really, with respect, I think very realistic. So your proposal demands, I think, a very long and significant extension before Article 50 finishes, which means we stay in the EU, etc., etc., etc. So is a shortcut at least. What are the chances of just adding the customs union to the deal? And that will bring the DUP, a lot of colleagues, your colleagues, my former colleagues on board. Most Tories, they would isolate the RG, but they're not going to bust the party apart over that. They'll still get Brexit, we'll be out of the treaty.
So I think my feeling is that there will be a willingness across the EU to support a short extension just for people to kind of get their act together. But I think they will certainly want to see a sense of purpose. And that's partly why I think it would be helpful for us to have established some sort of timetable or structure before the European Council, rather than just kind of drifting along and waiting till after. I certainly think that a customs union is one of the indicative votes that you could have, and might be one that is the easiest starting point, especially given all of the issues around the Northern Ireland border, and there is a paragraph within the withdrawal agreement that does suggest you're going to have a build on the single customs territory that obviates the need for rules of origins checks. Well, that is the common external tariff. That is a customs union. So that might be one option. Hilary Benn and the Brexit Select Committee have set out a series of possible things that you could have indicative votes on. So one option would be that you start from their indicative votes. Another option would be that you start from that the Prime Minister draws out a series of options. The other way to do it would be to just allow everybody to put forward amendments for different things, which could indeed be chaotic, but we're chaotic anyway at the moment. So actually, it might even end up looking more ordered.
Okay, so who still wants to ask a question? We've always come back to. Well, let me ask one question, and we may move towards the end unless somebody else thinks of one. What can go wrong with your basic plan, Yvette? It seems to me that when I talk to one or two hardline Eurosceptics, they say even if your motion passes on Thursday, so we think we're getting an extension, even if the EU grants the extension, is willing to grant extension, I think that the EU is willing to grant a short extension, whatever Dennis says, short extension. But still, Britain is actually going to leave the EU on the 29th of March unless legislation is passed or there's some legislative changes made. And people talk about the House of Lords holding things up through skullduggery and nefarious techniques. Are you worried that still, even if you win on Thursday, that there's still a chance that we might actually crash out because of some plot by ERG and the House of Lords?
I don't think so, because I think if the Commons voted against no deal, for the Lords to then scupper it would be such a constitutional crisis. I don't think the Lords will do that. But look, you're right that there are all kinds of things that can go wrong with this process, and that is why I think what the Prime Minister's done to get us to this position is so incredibly dangerous and irresponsible, because there are now so many risks that face us. You know, so I'm being just very honest about the process that I am setting out here. It's got a whole load of risks to it as well. It's just the best way I can see at the moment of adding a bit of common sense, having a bit of a way forward that provides some sensible steps to try and reduce the risks that we face. And that was why we got to this point about having the votes on no deal and the votes on Article 50 extension, was just to try and reduce some of the risks that our country faces, and to try and avoid the kind of the sort of vandalism to the country that is being done by the ERG group by pushing this sort of brinkmanship, and the weakness, I think, of the Prime Minister in resisting them. So hopefully, if we can set out an alternative process, this is almost a way to set the Prime Minister free from the ERG group.
So if the motion passes on Thursday, you trust the PM's government to do what it needs to do to deliver the impact, the effect of that motion? As far as we can see.
I think that they will. Do I have trust and confidence in any bit of this process anymore? I think probably none of us should, given that we've reached this point. But we can only do our best.
Right. Any final thoughts, comments, questions? In that case, I'll say thank you very much, Yvette, and come back again soon.